be joined by my next guest on the podcast. His name's Tim Dieppe. He's the head of public policy at a group called, or an organisation called Christian Concern in the UK. So, Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great to speak to you.
Hey, we'd love to hear more about Christian Concern and what you guys are involved with.
Great, thank you very much. Well, Christian Concern really is a campaign organisation that campaigns for Christian values in the public square. Our strapline is sort of speaking of Jesus in the public square, and we do that through law and media and in the church as well. And we're most sort of well known for our legal cases, which often relate to free speech or Christians who've got in trouble for expressing their Christian faith in the workplace, whether it's a nurse wearing a cross and someone getting upset and being disciplined for that, whether it's a student who got expelled from university for posting on Facebook in support of marriage between a man and a woman and Christian sexual ethics, who got expelled from university for that, whether it's street preachers, whether it's teachers who, we got a teacher who misgendered, so to speak, a pupil and lost his job over that. And we've got a chaplain who preached a sermon saying you should be free to disagree, make your own mind up with LGBT ideology, and lost his job for that, and branded a safeguarding risk and referred to counter-extremism and stuff like that. So yes, lots of different cases, and we also campaign on things like beginning of life, end of life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and other threats in society, Islam, secularism, the whole LGBT agenda, all of that kind of thing.
Gosh, so basically you don't get any rest by the sound of it with that wide range of activities.
There's always a lot going on. Yeah.
Let's just tease out a bit of that legal work that you do. We're seeing a couple of cases developing here in New Zealand, but it sounds like to me that there's a major problem of living out, if you will, an orthodox or a traditional Christian view in the UK if you've got people being hauled over courts for misgendering someone or giving a talk on identity politics.
Yes. I mean, the cases, a lot of times employers do back down over these kind of things. But, one of our most shocking cases recently actually was somebody who was working for a housing association, and she was also campaigning for a Christian political party. And in her party political literature, one of the things she said is, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman. And she was sacked for that, for gross misconduct. Now, that's crazy. That's obviously free speech, and furthermore, it's political speech. So, after we sort of threatened legal action, the employer was fairly quick to come to a settlement and agree that pay her some compensation and sort that out. And this is kind of often what happens, really. We somebody gets sacked. People think it's outrageous. How can they possibly say that? And then actually the law does still protect people's free speech, and so they either back down or they lose in court or something like that. And hopefully that sends a warning to other employers not to go down this route. But the point is that our culture has moved to a situation where people believe that it is justified or should be justified to sack someone for expressing simple Christian beliefs like marriage is between a man and a woman, or for raising concerns about sex education, fairly explicit sex education for young children. One of our other cases, a lady called Christy Higgs, put a petition up on Facebook sharing widely shared concerns about sex education for young children, how explicit it is, and so on. And somebody, one of her Facebook quote friends, reported her to her school, and she was sacked for gross misconduct. Now that case is rolling through the courts. We've had a kind of technical win, and we're appealing it to get a full win, which is a very unusual situation, but that's kind of where we are on it. And we're confident that we will ultimately win that, because you can't just sack someone for doing that. But this has taken like 4 years or something to get to that position. And but again, because it's gone through the courts, up into the Court of Appeal kind of thing, then it sets a stronger legal precedent, which then helps future cases going forwards about the protection for people in terms of free speech and what they can say on Facebook and so on. But we are entering into a fairly totalitarian kind of culture. The police as well will arrest a street preacher because someone's complained about him being homophobic or transphobic or misgendering or something like that. And we've got about 100% or virtually 100% track record of getting street preachers cleared. But the point is that the police aren't learning their lessons. They arrest them and think that being offensive is an offence, or that misgendering is a crime, which it is not. Or that insulting Islam is a crime, which it is not. But the point is that very sadly, people believe that these things are crimes or ought to be crimes when they're not yet. But if the culture's going that way, someday the law will follow unless things turn around at some point.
That's what was crossing my mind in terms of, well, as you say, the law currently is protecting these people, but actually in the future it might not. I mean, how has the UK got to that, I would suggest you, quite extraordinary position where you can't have a different set of views on topics of the day? So views on other religions, on transgender.
Well, this is the natural extension of sort of political correctness, which sort of came in 20, 30 years ago, quite a long time ago, and has caused people to sort of be concerned about what they can say and think you can't say this, you can't say that, and people self-censor their opinions, and then the extension of that is to when people do express opinions like that, and the majority seem to think that that's beyond the pale, then people sort of clamp down and say that's awful. You said something beyond the pale. You can't possibly say that men are men and women are women, or marriage between a man and a woman, or something like that. And so the penalty becomes worse than kind of like social ostracization, but kind of like you should lose your job for that, or you should be arrested for that, or something like that. And that's kind of the natural progression of this kind of like restriction on the way people should think or should say things that comes straight out of a kind of communist playbook, really. Political correctness was the way that communism came in and so on as well.
Yeah, well, control of language and then the control of ideas. Again, I just find it quite extraordinary. Our New Zealand police have just started actually recording what they deem to be hate speech crimes when we actually don't have any hate speech law on the books. They're literally, Tim, being trained at the moment to identify by saying two genders, even arguing for free speech as examples of supposed hate speech. And New Zealanders are having their names recorded in a database. It's just, I just can't fathom, even though we've discussed the why, how we've got here, that people think it's okay to criminalise someone for having an idea. It's nuts.
Well, of course, it is also symptomatic of abandoning Christian values in society, which the Christian moral foundation is what actually gives people freedom, and the idea that everyone is in the image of God and everyone has free will and is able to express their views and should have the right to express their views is founded in Christian values ultimately. And if we abandon Christian values, which we kind of largely have done, then the natural consequence is to tend to move towards more totalitarian kind of approach to politics that won't tolerate differences of opinion and won't tolerate politically incorrect stuff. And we're seeing some of the same stuff here. You've probably heard about some of the riots happening here, and I'm very concerned. Some people have been arrested in prison just for being there, being present, watching the riots. Somebody has been imprisoned for saying, fair enough, he said it quite aggressively, who the F is Allah kind of thing. But is that really something somebody should be imprisoned for doing? Saying that, can you imagine them being imprisoned for insulting Jesus in the same way? I can't imagine that, to be honest. I don't think that would happen at all. We are very close to having an Islamic blasphemy law in this country. People are calling for it as a response to the riots. The Labour Party has officially adopted in its code of conduct a definition of Islamophobia, which basically is anything that criticises perceived Muslimness, which is so vague that it covers pretty much anything and would effectively be an Islamic blasphemy law. And that is already part of the Labour Party's code of conduct. Labour Party is a majority party in Parliament today, so very few MPs in the majority party would speak out against adopting that in law. So we could easily have an Islamic blasphemy law, and if you do that, then you can't criticise Islam, and you've kind of lost the country really effectively to Islam at that point. It's a tipping point.
Yeah. Oh, look,
So
it's crazy. I've seen, as you say, we're looking from afar at the riots. Never let a good crisis go to waste, I think is one of the old political adages, and it does seem the push to try and clamp down on social media, and as you say, to push blasphemy laws.
Well, people have been arrested for posting footage of violence on the streets, which if we hadn't posted it, somebody hadn't posted it, nobody would know about it in some cases, because there were no journalists there and nobody else reporting it. So again, this is kind of silencing what is happening and not avoiding people, showing people what's really happening on the streets as well. So yes, we could be heading for quite dark times, unfortunately. In our countries, I heard that, is this right? In New Zealand, you've just enacted a sort of pandemic crisis law that would enable the government to force vaccinations and all of that kind of thing.
That's it. Actually, not really. It's been misunderstood. There's been an update to the pandemic plan, and it's referencing laws that we've had on the books since 1956, which allows the Director of Health, in a crisis, to be able to detain someone. So long and short, yes, at one level, but these are, if you will, laws that we've had since 1956. But it's still upsetting people because we went through a COVID time where freedom of speech, religion, freedom of movement was all just tossed out the door. And for what it's worth, Tim, I've often said, human rights exist for the bad times. They don't exist for the good times. You don't need rights.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, that's a good point. And actually, as you may know, we scored a significant victory during COVID here in the UK. We objected to the enforced closure of churches, or the enforced banning of public worship, effectively. I mean, the churches were allowed to run food banks, but if you did any prayer or worship, that would be a criminal offence. So we objected to criminalising Christian worship, which is basically what was happening there. And every time we tried to bring it into the courts, the government sort of reopened churches again, and it was therefore a moot case and wasn't going to go anywhere. But the Scottish government was foolish enough to keep churches closed in Scotland for longer. And so we managed to bring a case to the court in Scotland, and we actually won that case. And the judge found that enforced closure of churches was a breach of A, the Constitution, and B, human rights. And so the government had to back down and allow churches to open again and not criminalise Christian worship again. And I hope that that's a precedent that will be set that would help us in any future crisis and would warn any future government not to go down this route of criminalising Christian worship, which is basically what they did.
We had that sadly here in New Zealand, along with a lot of Christian leaders either supporting it, wanting to go further. I'm not saying all by any means, but this is one of the problems we ran into. I remember I was in Parliament at the time, Tim, and mentioning in the House, in the Parliament, that it was perfectly fine to go to restaurants or a brothel, but you couldn't go into a church. And it's just like, how did you reach this? I kid you not. It was just absolutely absurd. And unfortunately, Christian leaders supporting it, oh, well, no, we just have to protect people. And it's like, why? That makes no sense. Very inconsistent.
Well, I wrote some articles about that, lessons from church history on coronavirus. And of course, much worse plagues in the past, like cholera or the plague. Christians, the sort of the liberal Christians, or the sort of Christians in name only, effectively sort of ran away from the towns, whereas the faithful Christians stayed in the towns, or even went in the towns and kept the churches open, and even went to visit the sick at great risk to themselves, and often caught the disease and died of it, but received great respect for continuing to preach the gospel and continuing to meet and pray and offer spiritual care for people, and ultimately won the right to have nonconformity recognised here in the UK. That was in the plague, and in the cholera epidemic, Spurgeon was preaching. Again, I've got lessons from Spurgeon on coronavirus, which you can Google and find that article as well. And Spurgeon preached about cholera and talked about, hygiene is one thing, but also we need to pray and recognise it's something that God is doing, and it's a sign of God's judgment on the nation, and all of that kind of thing as well. And I think that few Christians were looking at church history to learn lessons from how churches should respond to this kind of thing. And what, the lesson from the plague is that, Christians who run away and who are in fear, they're the ones who think, well, I don't want to be like that. That's obviously not the right response. The right response from a Christian perspective is to act in faith and with courage, and to carry on ministering and not to count the cost.
Jumping back to particularly the whole blasphemy side, I mean, how I assume, sorry, I'm probably projecting, like New Zealand about 5 years ago ditched its blasphemy law, which was a Christian blasphemy law. It had sat on the book. I don't think it had been used for years and years and years. And yet we also have this push to have effectively an Islamic blasphemy law. Or also on all the other topics of the day.
Do you have a definition of Islamophobia or something like that?
No, not yet. They're working on it. They are trying to parallel off the anti-Semitism definition and then just apply it. And that also applies if you want to question identity politics or anything as well. There's a number of reviews. But again, I just struggle to reconcile how at one moment everyone's very happy to get rid of blasphemy laws and then literally 5 minutes later reintroduce them in a different spot. Is it simply that they just want the blasphemy that suits them?
Well, there's a case for saying that any society always has a kind of blasphemy law of some kind, that there are always some things that the society finds beyond the pale or outrageous or should be a criminal offence to say. And if it's identity politics, it's like you actually, what's going on here is you're making yourself God, aren't you? Saying, I define who I am. Basically, I've created myself. And then if you say, no, you're not really a woman, you're a man, or something like that, then they get very upset because you're kind of blaspheming their God, and they express it like, this is core to my identity. How can you say that? And then misgendering is like viewed as the worst crime going, and that is kind of a form of blasphemy, that in that sense. And with the Islam thing, this is a form of deference to Islam, that people don't respect Christianity, but kind of respect Muslims, respect Islam, and feel like it's awful that people insult and criticize Islam and so on. And so, and feel like that would be the way to stop community tensions and so on. And actually, it will only increase it, because people will see that Islam has got a privileged status that it really ought not to have. And so it won't help, and it will and seriously impact free speech and seriously affect our culture, and will be one step towards basically Islamization of our culture, a very significant step towards that. So yes, I've been worrying about this for some time. I wrote a report recently on Islamophobia, blasphemy by the back door. It's a report for the Free Speech Union. If you Google Free Speech Union Islamophobia, you'll probably find it. The foreword was written by Richard Dawkins, who you may have heard of, famous atheist. And they got a famous atheist to write it sort of as an antidote to me being a Christian. But it's warning about this particular definition, and which has been adopted by not just Labour Party but also Liberal Democrats, Green Party, the Scottish National Party, and various other political parties, and local councils and various other organisations as well. But it would introduce a kind of blasphemy code. I've been warning about this for some time, and I'm very concerned about how that could happen quite soon, potentially, under this Labour government, with the catalyst of these riots giving them the excuse they need to go and do it.
Well, that's as I say, the former politician in me knows that, you don't let crises go to waste. And that's not justifying what they're doing, but I've noticed, obviously, that the variety of drivers within the riots, the inability for people to actually speak, and I'm probably going to articulate this badly, but the government it wants to control the narrative, hence attacking Elon Musk and X and others who are enabling, if you will, citizen journalism. They don't want that. But jumping, if I could, to another case, some New Zealanders won't have heard of. Is it Bernard Randall? He had come across my desk. I know someone that you represented, a chaplain who was sacked from his job because he talked about identity politics in a sermon.
Well, that's right. I alluded to him earlier. So he's a Church of England chaplain in a Christian school, and what had happened is the school had a very pro-trans group in called Educate and Celebrate that came, and they even got staff to chant "Smash heteronormativity" in a staff meeting, and this obviously caused a bit of tensions in the school to say, and he had a pupil say to him, why do we have to accept this LGBT stuff? I thought we were a Christian school. Can you say something in the sermon about this? And he wants to always be open to the pupils suggesting what topics he should address in sermons. And he thought, yes, I should address this. So he preached a sermon. You can read it freely online. The sermon basically says we should be tolerant of people with different views. And we should allow people to have different views, and you don't have to accept LGBT ideology, and lots of Christians don't accept it and haven't accepted it. You need to make up your own mind. That's really what he said. It was a sermon really on tolerance, but the school demonstrated its intolerance by sacking him, effectively for preaching that sermon, which he preached in 2019. So now, approaching 5 years ago. I think he was sacked in 2020. And as I said, he was referred to our counter-extremism government group called Prevent. He was referred to as a safeguarding risk to the local authority and our disclosure and borrowing services. And the Church of England diocese also branded him a safeguarding risk, which means he can't preach a sermon at any church across the country and can't minister in any way whatsoever because he's a safeguarding risk for his sermon. And we've challenged this. We've gone to court against the school for discrimination and wrongful dismissal. We lost that case initially in the first round of that, but we're going to appeal that decision, and that appeal is pending the decision in this other case I mentioned called Christie Hicks, which we believe we're going to win, which would help his case. But the point is, his case now won't be heard till next year, which is 2025. Again, sort of 5 years since he was sacked and I've been unable to work and so on. But then the other thing that we've highlighted this week is the Church of England. So he's now been cleared by, counter-extremism and safeguarding organizations, and so all the secular organizations have cleared him and said he did nothing wrong. There's no reason why he shouldn't be allowed to teach. But the Church of England carries on regarding him as a safeguarding risk, and seems to regard him as a safeguarding risk for his orthodox belief in Church of England doctrine. So, it actually seems to have ruled that Church of England doctrine as a safeguarding risk itself. And with no explanation to Bernard, has maintained for 4 years or 5 years that he is a safeguarding risk. He's got a safeguarding thing against him. And Bernard has complained about this to the bishop, gone nowhere, complained then to the Archbishop of Canterbury. It got as far as nearly getting a church tribunal on this, and a legal advisor saying that the Archbishop of Canterbury had not dealt with this properly and misunderstood his powers, and that the decision to brand him a safeguarding role was clearly a flawed process and all of this kind of thing. But at the last moment, it was they decided not to have a tribunal and advised to reconsider, and that was 6 months ago, and still nothing's happened, and still he is a safeguarding risk. So all we're trying to do is carry on pursuing this and embarrass the Church of England into reinstating him, basically. But it is shocking the way he's been treated. I think we'll win in the end with him, because people can read the sermon and see, and there's, it's ridiculous to sack him for saying let's be tolerant. The school is the one that's been intolerant here, and he was preaching tolerance and was sacked for it, and this kind of demonstrates where we are. This LGBT ideology is intolerant and will not tolerate dissent, and the school thinks it's entirely justified to sack him for saying you should tolerate different views. That's actually what they sacked him for.
Again, I use the word extraordinary a lot, but when there are real, if you will, terrorist or safeguarding threats in our respective communities, by the way, it's beyond my understanding at one level that governments, police, anti-terrorist organisations are worried about words rather than someone who's, threatening Taylor Swift concerts, stabbing MPs. I think of Sir David Amess, of course, amongst others. Just extraordinary. But I suppose the other thing, Tim, for what it's worth, is that I think a lot of projection happens from these activist groups. So when they talk about people being intolerant, they're really talking about themselves. Or if they are talking equity, it's not really what they believe in. That they are if you will, projecting. It's that concern, which is why we have these conversations, hopefully that people will begin to think a bit more clearly, certainly within the Christian communities, to speak up, because I think it feels, certainly here in New Zealand too, that the fences are closing in. It's the noose is tightening on our ability to express our faith.
Definitely. No, definitely. Definitely it's become more oppressive. Definitely people are self-censoring in the workplaces. When I talk to people in my church and lots of other people and our clients and so on, and people are really, very afraid to say what they really think or to express their real opinions on stuff. They'll shy away from it. Because they know that people will jump on them and really have a go at them. And the law may protect them, and I think it will protect them, but the fact is that the process and the time it takes and all of that kind of thing is part of the punishment, and you don't want to go through that if you can avoid it.
Exactly right. Again, we haven't had it to the same degree, but similar dynamics here. Just the police turning up to your door is problematic enough, let alone through the whole time. Jumping from the particular cases, I know you guys also do a lot of advocacy across a wide range of issues. We have a euthanasia review coming up. New Zealand has a euthanasia law. What's happening in the UK at the moment? Is it yet another push coming?
Oh, yes. Well, so fortunately, we do not have euthanasia legalized in this country. There's been like 10 attempts in the last 15 years in Parliament to legalize euthanasia, plus some legal cases where they've tried to sort of change the law through a particularly legal case. They've all failed. But now what we had, I think, in the last election was the leaders of all three major parties are basically pro or not opposed to euthanasia. And there was a big campaign by a famous personality here, Esther Ranson, to allow herself to have assisted suicide. And there is now a private member's bill in Parliament which will be debated in the autumn or so. It's unlikely to actually go through to law, but the indication of what the support will be significant. And the government has promised to allow parliamentary time for a full debate on it, which I think would happen some point later. So it's that's another thing that's very much on the agenda here in the UK, the possibility of having euthanasia legalised. And we're trying to highlight that in every country where it has been legalised, the criteria have been watered down over time, and it's a slippery slope. It's a very powerful point. And we even had a respected commentator here who argued in a Times newspaper article that one of the dangers that people say about assisted suicide is that it will put pressure on the elderly and vulnerable to die. And he said, yes, that's right, and that's a good thing. And people were shocked about that, and it actually changed some people's views. So we're kind of trying to highlight things like that in terms of trying to pose that. And of course, going to the other end of life, abortion. I don't know what it's like over there, but during COVID, we had emergency provision to allow pills by post-abortion because people weren't allowed to go to clinics. And although we tried very hard to challenge that in law and so on, that became the measure, and actually then was voted on to be permanent by MPs. So that is now how the vast majority of our abortions happen. A phone call. We've done mystery client surveys to show that somebody can give a fake name, a fake address, a fake GP, and also a illegal reason for wanting the pills, and they will post the pills to you anyway. All sorts of risks then of coercion, obtaining from other people, all of these, gestation not being properly checked and so on. And there have been one or two cases of people taking them way beyond the safe, quote safe, gestational limit, which is 10 weeks. Even before that 10-week limit, we've shown that about 1 in 17 people who take these pills end up in hospital, which is like shockingly unsafe. Like you can't buy any pills over the counter that are anything like that level of risk. And hospitals are seeing this kind of thing happening. So that's kind of where we are on that. But then also the government is bringing into law buffer zones, so-called, around abortion clinics, where you're not allowed to mention abortion or say anything about abortion. We've had one woman who was arrested for silently praying outside an abortion clinic. Now the government has said that's not something that's mentioned in this law, so you should be allowed to do that. Nevertheless, she was arrested by police for doing that. And we've had another guy who was arrested for displaying a sign just with the verse from Psalm 139, fearfully wonderfully made, or in my mother's womb, or something like that. So and he was arrested for that and charged and convicted initially, I think. And we're trying to challenge the legality of these things, say this is a breach of human rights. But we're not, so far we haven't succeeded, but that's an ongoing process. But basically it was voted on by Parliament to make this measure, and this was before the election, so under the last government, to basically criminalise certain types of speech in certain areas.
Unfortunately, New Zealand's ahead of you in this. They created safe spaces 4 or so years ago, a 300 metre or 150 diameter, so quite substantial, very chilling effect. And literally, Tim, weeks before the COVID lockdown, as things were beginning to spiral, the government here passed probably one of the most extreme abortion laws in the world, and that it's pretty much legal to birth. Access to pills is just perfectly fine, very, very easy. And even when I put an amendment forward that some medical care should be given to babies born alive, that was sickeningly voted down. And we know that some babies are born alive through botched abortions, but they're now just to be left. It's just quite horrifying. Wow. Culture of life being attacked at both ends. I am conscious of your time, though. So one last question. I know it's more the medical transgender side, but you've had the now, I'd say, quite famous Cass report. Is that changing the dynamic in play in the UK? Is it changing the discussion?
It is. I would say that transgenderism is the one area where we're winning, or where the tide is turning, or where the tide is going the right way. Every other area in our culture we're losing, and the tide is becoming more anti-Christian or anti-truth. But in transgenderism, the tide has really moved against it for lots of different reasons. I mean, Scotland here wanted to bring in a self-identification law, and it caused a huge fuss because they were saying it's transphobic to say this would be used by rapists to get into female prisons. And then, lo and behold, there was a convicted sex offender who identified as a woman was allowed to go into a female prison. And this caused a huge fuss and a rebellion. And the British government, British Parliament, before the election, actually used its powers to say, no, Scotland, you're not allowed to bring in a law allowing for self-identification. And that caused a huge public backlash against this kind of thing. And then there's also been backlash against children being allowed to transition, and the whistleblowers in our clinic called Tavistock, which was providing this kind of service, were saying that this is being done too fast and too quick, and puberty blockers are actually not just time to wait or time to pause, they actually have long-term effects, and actually this idea that it just gives you time to pause is false, because 99.9% of cases they end up going on to cross-sex hormones and carrying on down the transition route. And then the Cass review came out earlier this year and basically raised big questions about puberty blockers and about the way that things are done and the way that the care is processed and so on, and caused the government to actually ban puberty blockers across the country, apart from an experimental case for a trial, which unfortunately is a loophole. And so they have just started this trial to allow puberty blockers for some people on that trial. But that is a massive step forward in terms of the transgender thing, and then of course most recently you've had in the Olympics shocking sights of an obviously biological male person smashing female boxers. She's got XY or he's got XY chromosomes. I mean, you've got to feel compassion for these people in every case, but in this particular case, because he was raised as a woman, but does have XY chromosomes and for all intents and purposes really functions as a biological male, and has gone through all of the puberty growth and so on that a biological male has. So it's manifestly unfair. The Olympics have basically covered themselves in shame by allowing this and saying basically that gender is just self-ID, just opening the door to somebody saying, okay, I'm going to put it on my passport, I'm a woman, or get my country to put it on my passport, I'm a woman, and then I'll go and win a gold medal in boxing or something else. And that the sense of fairness that people have, and this has rebelled against that as well. So there is backlash against transgenderism. It's not complete yet. There are still loopholes, but I think a few years back you had Keir Starmer, our current Prime Minister, struggling to answer the question, "What is a woman?" and saying, "Oh, you shouldn't say that only women have a cervix, or it's just something that shouldn't be said." And then because of this backlash, he came right round to, no, yes, the biological women, and we shouldn't be allowing self-identification and so on, and that it's become politically okay to say that trans women are not women, kind of thing. So the Overton window has moved on that one, and we will see, because the previous government brought out draft guidance for teachers in schools, which actually was quite good, and said that no teacher or pupil should be compelled to use preferred pronouns of a pupil in the rare cases where that should be allowed. I mean, I don't think it should be allowed in any cases, but this was saying maybe in rare cases it should be allowed. The government was recently asked a question in writing from a member of the House of Lords about whether they will allow a teacher to use a pupil's legal and biological pronouns, and they said, "We're thinking about it." And they're going to respond to the consultation, which started before the election, and they're going to take into account the Cass review. And I hope that this means that the official guidance, when it comes out from the government, will say what the draft guidance said, that no teacher or pupil should be compelled to use preferred pronouns. But we have a much more liberal government, and this may not be the way it turns out. But they know that there's big pressure on this stuff, and they know there's massive backlash on it, and they know there's pressure to define sex in law as biological and so on as well. So this is the one area where we are actually, it's going the right way for us here in the UK. I don't know what it's like in New Zealand.
Yeah, we haven't really reacted as definitively, if I could say it that way, as the UK. So a lot of our people haven't even read the Cass report, including ministers, which is a bit shocking. They're working on new guidelines, but it's all transgender activists who are talking about, we have to understand this in a New Zealand context, which doesn't make any sense to me. But there is agitation across the community. Again, it's that compulsion. So I suppose for many of us, put it really simply, people can be what they want to be. You just shouldn't be forcing me or anyone else to have to go along with it. And we can still act with respect. That's really important too. But there's all of that. Our law commission's trying to bring in gender as a cause for discrimination. So a little bit like the Islamic blasphemy laws, they want to bring in gender-specific blasphemy. So it's all swirling around us here, but the dial does seem to be changing a little bit, because people are hearing what's happened in the UK, and they're looking towards the Nordic countries and going, gosh, they're so liberal, and yet they're banning or reducing the use of puberty blockers. So there's a little bit of change going on there, which is, I think, good to see.
Yeah, and the other subject is conversion therapy, of course, which is linked into all of this kind of thing. Interestingly, the Cass review did say that it mentioned that clinicians feel they have to affirm someone's gender, because if they don't, they could be accused of so-called conversion therapy, and that any ban would risk this. Now, what we have in the UK, we already have a professional ban, effectively, on conversion therapy, because all the mainline counselling and NHS groups and so on have signed up to a memorandum of understanding that says we won't engage in any form of conversion therapy, which is what then causes them to all feel they have to affirm even a child's gender identity, because if they don't, they could be accused of engaging in conversion therapy and lose your job. But the proposal is to bring in a law, and in fact, it's part of the Labour Party's manifesto, and they promised to engage in it in the recent King's Speech, and they're planning to bring out a draft law on conversion therapy within the next year or so. Now, the only sort of consolation of that is it's a draft law, which means they're recognising that there are issues here that will need to be dealt with and discussed, and that there'll be some, presumably, pre-legislative scrutiny of some kind, discussion about it, and they're recognising there's serious free speech concerns and freedom of religion concerns about any potential ban. And there has been some backlash. Certainly, before the election, there was a House of Lords bill about conversion therapy got soundly defeated in the House of Lords and robustly criticised for what it would do to criminalise potentially parents and youth leaders and all of this kind of thing. And I think the government is being made aware that in some other countries they've backed down from banning conversion therapy because it's too complicated or because of these various issues. But we have a government that's determined to do it, that promised it in its manifesto and is going ahead with it. So, but it will be a battle, we'll see. So that's another looming threat that we have here in this country.
Well, sad to report, we have a conversion therapy law in New Zealand. I argued, as did a couple of others at the time, it wasn't needed. But it was a conflation of what we all deem as abhorrent, which is if you're going to be tying up and forcefully trying to change someone, to actually what the law was all about, which was to say you must only affirm a person. And we've already had that chilling effect. No one's actually been prosecuted under the law or pulled into any arbitration, interestingly enough. But its fundamental point is a chilling effect on free speech and freedom of religion because, having a conversation that doesn't affirm, you could be accused of, and we've already had one Christian school where activists hinted at our conversion therapy law because they were talking about marriages between a man and a woman, and they were hinting that that could be trying to convert the children. So you can see I say to you, there in the UK, you can see the inherent dangers. But Tim, I'm incredibly grateful that you've given us so much of your time and just taken us through just a little bit, really, of what you guys do there at Christian Concern, and thank you for the leadership that you give.
Pleasure. Well, thank you for what you're doing as well, and I hope you're able to resist a lot of this stuff and speak out about it and stand firm against it. And we just need churches to be strong and firm and outspoken and courageous in these increasingly challenging times, I think.